Another news tonight, Justice and Constitutional Development Department officials have now released the Whistleblowing Legislative Landscape proposals, basically for public comment. The draft laws would borrow a lot from existing legislation in other nations such as New Zealand, Canada, Australia and the US, as well as UK and Kenya. It would basically, among other things, seek to compensate whistleblowers who are involved, for example, in lifting the lid on corruption and fraud. Some of the other things proposed is making sure that there's not just legal assistance, but emotional care as well. For more on this, let's speak to Whistleblower Athol Williams, who, at the height, in fact, of the period post-disclosures he made related to state capture, had to go into exile because he felt he was no longer safe in his country of birth, South Africa. Athol, a very good evening to you. Good to speak to you. So, would I be right to say tonight that had some of these proposals come into effect in the last, 5 years or so, your life may have panned out very differently?
Absolutely, my life would be substantially different. So while it's encouraging that the government is now putting forward these very early draft ideas, they're quite far still from coming into law, it's quite encouraging. But it would have made a big difference to my life and many other whistleblowers if this had been in force when we blew the whistle years ago.
And do you think government is on track just in terms of the proposed areas of expansion? For example, for viewers who may not have seen it, I want to go through some of what is proposed here. They talk about, for example, expanding the scope of the Protected Disclosures Act to cover an area more vast than just the employer-employee relationship, establishing a fund, for instance, to assist whistleblowers, and granting greater authority to the Human Rights Commission in handling protected disclosures. And the Justice Ministry is hoping that this will then positively impact what it says is the promotion of transparency and accountability in various sectors. Are they on the money?
I think those three you mentioned are significant proposals, and I really hope we see them come into force. So the idea of protecting not only employees, but anyone, whether you're employed or not, who blows the whistle, I think that's a very important development. I think also holding employers or those implicated accountable when they retaliate against whistleblowers is a very important addition as well, which I've seen in the document, which is encouraging. And then to your point about the South African Human Rights Commission, giving them greater powers. A lot of us have been calling for a whistleblower ombudsman, so someone or some capacity, some institution with the capacity to support whistleblowers. Some even called for a special court to deal with whistleblower cases. So if the idea of capacitating the Human Rights Commission to do some of these things, and I think that's also very encouraging. But we certainly do need some institution particularly focused on whistleblower cases and protecting and caring for whistleblowers.
And which of the proposals do you think would have served best or served you best in your instance? Because you spoke out, exposed state capture as far as the involvement of the global consultancy firm Bain & Co. And as I was saying, you were then basically made to pay the price to the point where you fled the country.
Well, there are two areas that I didn't find were sufficiently dealt with. The one is the proposals are very future-focused. So I think once these come into force, we'll have a very different environment in South Africa of protecting whistleblowers. And I think it's important to protect whistleblowers legally, financially, and physically. The document is silent on existing whistleblowers. So all of those, a few hundred of us were involved with the State Capture Commission and other parts of corruption in our country. It's not clear whether we retroactively will get any support from government under the current proposal. And so I would want to see some commentary on that. The second one is something you touched on, this idea of a whistleblower fund. And I think it's very important to have some financial capability to support whistleblowers financially. What concerned me was the language in the proposed document talked about satisfying whistleblowers' basic needs. Now, while it's important to have whistleblowers' basic needs taken care of, I don't think that's sufficient as an incentive for anyone to step forward. If all you're doing is saying, Athol, you won't starve if you're a whistleblower, well, why would someone risk their job, their livelihoods, to step forward and be a whistleblower if all government is saying that they will take care of your basic needs? What I think we need is to say to people who step forward as whistleblowers is that they'll be made whole. They'll be no worse off as a whistleblower than they were before stepping forward and blowing the whistle.
And basic needs, of course, differ, right, from one person to the next, because depending on where you were in terms of your earnings, shall we say, and your experience in the workplace, and where you planned your trade, what is basic to you may not be basic to me. So there may perhaps need to be more clarity on what that would entail. Would there be a cap, for instance, if there's financial support? And who would determine that cap, and what would the criteria be?
I think it's a very important point. I do think we need some element of classification of whistleblowers, perhaps linked to element of seriousness of what they disclose. Because someone who discloses, theft of paper clips, we would treat differently. It's important that they disclose that, but we would treat them differently than if they disclose state capture that threatens to undermine our democracy. And so I think that's an important element. And then also your point, like you say, the seniority of the whistleblower. If you've got most major corruption activity happens at the senior executive level of organizations, and it often requires other senior executives to blow the whistle. And so, again, that needs to be factored in when thinking about compensation for whistleblowers. I was also encouraged that the government did seem to survey other countries and what they are doing. But we don't seem to have picked up on the idea of whistleblowers sharing in some of the funds they recover. So my whistleblowing, for example, was not involved in recovering any funds, so I wouldn't get a percentage of what I recovered. But others have, and I think that's quite a big incentive at times, and this is a controversial point, an incentive for people to step forward and blow the whistle.
And I want to come back to something that you said earlier, where these would not be retrospective, at least measures, as far as what we're hearing from the proposal. So that would mean that people such as yourself who spoke out in the past 5 years or so would not be covered, right? If there were to be measures put in place to ensure someone such as yourself is assisted in some way, would you come back home?
Absolutely. I mean, I am waiting and itching to get back home. I've written to the presidency 9 times and got no reply. In fact, 3 different South African ambassadors from different parts of the world have contacted the Minister of Justice and the presidency saying we must do something to get Athol back home, and still there's been no reply. So I'm waiting to come home, and for me it's simple. It's if I can get the assurance that I'll be protected physically, and if there's some element of financially being made whole so I can actually live my life and support my family, I'm absolutely home in a second. Because that's why I blew the whistle. It was because I care about South Africa, I care about our country, and that's where I need to be.
Do you think you'd ever find work here?
I think that'll be difficult because part of how I've been defamed and discredited by people, but that can be overcome. I think the bigger challenge is the fact that our society continues to shun whistleblowers. I was a senior executive. I worked for over 20 years in business, and there are many South African CEOs of listed companies who were my clients, who were my friends, but all of them have turned their back on me because the notion is I've broken from the boys' club. I haven't acted according to the code, which is for us all to protect ourselves rather than act in the interest of our country. And that needs to change. And so I understand it will be a challenge for me, but I need to be there to be challenging these people who claim to be South Africans, yet acting against our public interest. And so with government support, and that's where it's got to start, I think we can begin to turn that tide.
Athol Williams, good to speak to you, a whistleblower who spoke out during the state capture years and is now living abroad, basically in exile because he felt unsafe here at home.